Be still and know that I am with you. Be still and know. I remember when I was a little girl in a concrete tenement house on a university campus, inhabited partly by love, but infused also with my mother's anger, dysfunction, and neglect. I heard about people who believed in this entity called Jesus, and so I wrote him a letter. It felt a bit ridiculous, actually, even at age 6 or 7, to appeal to something I figured couldn't possibly exist, but I had this inclination to try. There must be something, I hoped, a little more than our empty home. He didn't answer, but I wasn't exactly disappointed. I felt even then that the human need to contain the vastness made up of something as complex as a co-evolving universe was not something that could be summed up in one concept. That the many gods and goddesses and faces of divinity around the world looked suspiciously human. And that was all right, because even at that tender age, I had this feeling like to know the fullness of the universe in its entirety would be to split back apart into atoms and resume a space of particulate nature in the breath of the cosmos. And I wanted to try on this human thing for a while. I love to be in my body. And my favorite hot springs on Highway 12, where each and every time my ecstasy is amplified by the fact that the trees feel it too. And in the everyday, watching the yellow finches perch on dandelion stalks in the rain, and my children focus intently on drawing a picture full of thought and effort, when I get the surge of feeling like I belong, like I'm at home. I loved it in childbirth, where I was certain I was going to split in two, or the time I swung out of a tree and cracked my tailbone so hard I assumed I was going to die. And it didn't seem possible that one could feel that much anguish and continue to exist. It's why I ride my mountain bike straight up the mountain and revel in the euphoria when I'm done. It is exquisite agony and pleasure to be human. This desire, this need to believe in something more than just what is in front of us feels not like a farce, but a natural occurrence of being made of dense matter that comes even from the stars. I met this woman when I lived and worked in Phoenix, who came from the Eastern Bloc. She had been through extreme torture in her home and as the result of the dynamics of her country. And she had this most amazing viewpoint that someday she would amass with other particles from around the universe and assume the density of a planet. That she was one day looking forward to trying on planetary size.
I used to think that to be strong looked like doing what needed to be done without surrendering to pain or grief or trauma or other challenges. I was taught that strong people hide their weaknesses and cultivate the capacity to soldier on. This version of strength is a brittle strength, though, because as stress piled upon stress and loss piled upon loss and trauma on trauma and so forth, the pressure to hold it all made me stiff. I lived constantly at the edge of my breaking point, and it wasn't a good or a healthy place to be. So eventually, I broke, and I learned that true strength has very little to do with how one presents to the world, and everything to do with the capacity to offer and accept grace, also known as unconditional love. It took several iterations for me to earn this lesson, several times of hitting bottom, having things fall apart, letting myself be overwhelmed by my own fundamental inadequacy. But over time, I stopped being afraid of failure and pain. I stopped being afraid of losing control or appearing to be less than perfect. Instead of cultivating a capacity to carry on, I cultivate the sure knowledge that no matter what happens, I am enough. Attachment to preserving the appearance of strength, having it all together. In my mind, this keeps us from accessing true strength. It makes us defensive when we come into contact with critique or differences of opinion. It keeps us from showing our sadness and so processing and integrating it into the whole. True strength grows when we're rooted deeply in love, when the soil that is our soul is rich with all the elements of life as it truly is, rather than attached to some theoretical version as life as we wish it could be. We need full access to our gifts and our vulnerabilities, to our successes and our failures, to our joy and to our grief. Rather than hiding or moving away from things that are uncomfortable, true strength moves toward those things, breathing until they're bearable, and breathing some more, and then breathing some more until the gifts they contain become apparent.
When I hear those words, I know that's why I cry or come close to crying every time I get in this room, which is actually lovely, and it's not all grief. It's just a sense of feeling that ability to be vulnerable and really present, and I just appreciate you all for that. And there are as many versions of spiritual truth, of course, as there are people, but we know the commonalities are more alike than not. That when a person feels alone and disconnected, her pains are more intense, meaning is harder to come by, and life itself is shortened. That when she feels connected and a part of something larger, she thrives and she shares that certainty, that warmth, that faith with others, and can in return receive. I never used to use the word faith because of its relationship to what I perceived as religious dogma. Its meaning only came to me as having personal relevance 5 or 6 years ago, when I realized that this process of getting older is a process of finding, testing, losing, and having faith. That over all these years, cycles inevitably repeat themselves. The mass exploitations of human, animal, and plant life, and the rebirth of new ecosystems. The explosions of war and the recuperations of peace. That hate crimes and acts of immense tenderness and solidarity repeat. It is difficult to be human over the long haul and not find some kind of awe in the extremes of our capacity to be kind and cruel. The peace begins in knowing that this cycle exists, and the faith, I think, arises in learning to dance with it. When things are going well, we don't have to worry someday that tragedy will strike. Of course it will. And when things are at their worst, we do not have to worry that joy will never return. Of course it does. I watch our resistance, how we fight the nature of the seasons, the nature of cycles, the very nature of being human, being a body, being a dense makeup of particles, of being particulate in and of itself. And yet I have learned also how acceptance is as simple as letting ourselves be moved, letting the rhythms of cycles permeate our bodies, allowing the wisdom and necessity of this expression to flow through us, allowing tears and laughter to form our communities, to soften our solitude, and lead us to the dynamic acceptance that is internal stillness.
I used to think that being wise meant never making mistakes. One should carefully consider all of the options and make lists and be rational and careful and never set a toe out of line. Only it turns out that people aren't omnipotent. Humans aren't omnipotents. And so I learned that true wisdom grows when we recklessly expose ourselves to life. When we listen with an open heart and approach the world with an open heart and let that heart lead, even actually especially when it's pulling us someplace we really don't want to go. I have a friend who used to ask when we were playing bridge, what would a prudent woman do? The mistake I was making was confusing wisdom with being prudent. And there's a place for being prudent, but just as an attachment to the appearance of strength keeps us from accessing true strength, attachment to being right keeps us from true wisdom. It also keeps us separate from one another. So let's talk about judgment, about how when we hear someone's story of suffering and struggle, some part of us wants to be able to say, well, they must have done something to deserve that. Because if they did something to deserve the bad things that happened to them, then we can avoid doing those same things, and so we can avoid suffering. So do you hear how fear becomes the root of judgment, of separation? Wisdom grows when we're able to admit, even in the face of stories that rip our hearts to shreds, there but for the grace of God go I. Better yet, it grows when we're willing to go there, to put ourselves right next to folks who are in pain, walking with them without judgment, holding them and their stories as precious and meaningful. It takes true courage to live life with radical openness. We can't keep hiding from pain or struggle, from each other or from our true selves. Instead of trusting that everything will turn out okay, we need to learn to trust that however things turn out, we have the strength and the wisdom to keep living and learning and loving.
Be still. The kind of stillness born by certainty that the world keeps spinning. And even if it someday does not, that too is part of the process. For me, I suppose this is all the more reason to be part of the dance in this particular way while I still can. To find ways to live in the paradoxical equation of accepting life for what it is, while striving to help and accept where needed. To listen to the stories of others and to tell my own. To continually increase the scope and magnitude of what I understand and can touch of the collective. Faith might start as the inclination to write a letter to a god or to a congressperson, maybe the star of my favorite Netflix drama. We can't take it all too seriously. In all this majesty, life is also so beautifully mundane. It's a series of reaching out, pushing away, trusting, getting hurt, and getting loved. It is a certainty that there is more than what we see, but also that we should take great care with what we see and with what we feel. Pay attention, listen, ask it to dance, and by all means, accept its invitation to do so. Having faith always indicates losing it at some point, so you can find it again.
Sharon Salzberg, the author of our first reading, has written a book in which she describes the evolution of faith. The first stage is bright faith, which feels like falling in love. We find a path or a guru or a spiritual leader who we think has figured out how to do this human thing. And we think they can teach it to us. Bright faith feels awesome, but it's fickle. Our path eventually goes someplace that doesn't work for us, or our guru turns out to have clay feet, or our spiritual leader says or does something that leaves us cold, and we come to a decision point. We look for a new path, a new guru or a new leader, seeking that feeling of bright faith. Or we enter the next stage, verifying faith. Verifying faith is a time of testing and doubting. We take the truths that are offered to us and we compare them to our experiences, our own deep truths, our own intuition. We pick and choose. We move through confusion and despair. We create our own path, one slow and careful step at a time. And if we do this work with patience and compassion for ourselves and one another, we eventually arrive at the third stage, abiding faith. Abiding faith is hard to put into words. It grows in us slowly as we move toward all of life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It grows in us when we embrace the fullness of this human adventure we are on. As Salzberg puts it, abiding faith does not depend on borrowed concepts. Rather, it is the magnetic force of a bone-deep, lived understanding, one that draws us to realize our ideals, walk our talk, and act in accord with what we know to be true. Abiding faith grows as we realize that we are connected in majesty and in mystery to all that is. We realize that everything will be okay, and nothing will be okay, and everything will be okay. So we realize that none of us get out of here alive, and that our fears of loss and grief and trauma and death only serve to keep us from what sweetness life has to offer. So we realize that justice matters, that is in our nature to be compassionate. So we realize that gratitude is what creates happiness, and acceptance is what creates peace. As we learn that love matters most of all. It grows as we realize that every second of this human journey is worthy of praise, and the praising is what saves us. So be it, and so may it be.